that are happening at the beginning of 2013 in recruitment process outsourcing. Just for the sake of history here, because we're going to be sharing this presentation online, we're recording this in January of 2013. So, if it's a little bit after there, you can kind of see if these trends are still perpetuating. But what I could tell you is what we're about to go through today is absolutely what we, an RPO provider, is seeing with a fair amount of frequency. So I'd like to go ahead and just show you what we're going to cover. And we'll talk about just the perspective from which we come from. I always think it's important to level set where you're hearing the trends and how we're hearing them develop. So we'll give you our perspective, tell you a little bit about us just so you could gain that perspective. We'll talk about the trends in detail. There's 4 specific, and we'll go into them in a fair degree of detail. Towards the end, I'm going to take just about 5 or 10 minutes to show you the approach that we take when we try to help our clients with recruitment process outsourcing. And then lastly, a closer look at how and why strategic sourcing and recruiting is really going to be much more relevant to the evaluation of RPO programs, more so today than ever before. So let's go ahead and take a look at our perspective. So for those of you that don't know who we are, Yoh is a child of a larger company called Day & Zimmerman. Day & Zimmerman is about the 53rd largest privately held company in the United States. We were founded in 1901. Quite a bit of revenue, $2.7 billion, or give or take. Our headquarters is Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and we have locations in about 150 different countries with about 25,000 employees. On the right there, you could see the areas of focus that Day & Zimmerman handles. So a lot of government services work, workforce solutions, and whatnot. What we're going to focus on today is what Yoh does. So just to give you a little bit about Yoh, Yoh is completely focused on workforce solutions. Again, Day & Zimmerman acquired Yoh in 1961, and it was founded in 1940. So we have the distinction of being the oldest and the first professional technical staffing firm in the nation. And you can see some of the rankings that we've got there, just to give you a perspective of our size, who we are, and what we focus on. So that tells you a little bit about the perspective from which we're coming when we discuss these trends. And again, I think it's always important to level set that so you can properly factor in these trends as they impact your business. And again, I say that in the interest of candor, because larger RPO organizations that handle different types of programs might have different perspective on that. But what I can tell you is, in speaking with a lot of the analyst organizations, not just in the U.S. but globally, we're getting a lot of affirmation that yes, indeed, these are trends that are happening mostly in the U.S. but certainly globally as well. So let's go ahead and change gears here and talk about workforce certainty, because what I want you to consider here is that ultimately what Yoh tries to do in our objectives is to help anyone that we interact with achieve their objectives, and we do it by trying to eliminate a lot of the doubts, a lot of the disruptions and risks that are related to managing scarcity of skilled workers. So that's what we set out to achieve, and this is again the perspective from which we take a look at the trends that are impacting the RPO industry. So let's shift gears and jump right into those trends right now. So there's 4, and we're going to go through each one of them in detail. And there's a great blog post on this. If you want to go catch that after this webinar, we encourage you to go ahead and take a look at that. It covers each one of these in a fair amount of detail. But the trends are these: consolidation, service segmentation, the dawn of co-sourcing, and then an increase in the priority of pipelining itself. So let's take a look at consolidation. So, this is one of those interesting scenarios where there's been quite a bit of merger and acquisition activity within this industry. However, there's not been a lot of commonality to it. And we feel that M&A will slow down into 2013, but we also think that sometimes a lot of rapid merger and acquisition kind of says something about the industry. But if you take a look, and we're going to step through some of the most recent acquisitions, that fact that there's really been no single driving factor that's driven a lot of this consolidation is actually more indicative of not a mature discipline, but a maturing discipline. So let's take a closer look at that. So Pinstripe, not really necessarily an acquisition, but they recapitalized recently. So that's kind of what was the driver there. So they took on some equity. Usually, again, this isn't always the case, but 9 times out of 10, if an organization engages a private equity firm recapitalizes, gives up some of that equity for a cash infusion, they're usually looking for some kind of future sale of the organization. If not, they're definitely looking for immediate growth. But most times, private equity firms are not interested in being involved unless there is a reward for their investment. So that's typically what we see there. If we take a look at Connexa, more of a technology play. Now, this was a large acquisition from IBM, and really the driver here seems to be a global data and sourcing technology platform that rounds out IBM's ability to offer their clients more within their portfolio of products and services. So you see a lot of this in big ERP and in big systems integrators and whatnot, kind of filling out what they call a white space transaction, if you will. But again, it appears outside looking in. Again, you'd have to ask Connexa or IBM what their ultimate driver, but the objective observation appears that, hey, look, IBM sought the robust, not just data, but also this robust technology and the unique kind of intellectual capital that Connexa has when evaluating the way they do to source and recruit on a global scale. If we take a look at The Right Thing, which is actually probably more of a tuck-in white space fulfillment, The Right Thing was acquired by ADP, and it makes sense if you consider that ADP is the largest provider of payrolling services. So typically, again, in large service providers, business process outsourcers and whatnot, they seek to fill in or do tuck-in acquisitions that offer additional services to their client base. So certainly doesn't look like any of the previous two. And then lastly, we'll take a look at SourceRight, acquired by Randstad not too long ago. And it seems here that really a lot of the motivation for the acquisition was more of a geographical coverage or an expansion of services there. So what's unique here is that nothing is similar. All four of these look different. Again, so while there's consolidation happening in this industry, it's not a ordered consolidation or a collapse of providers down to just a few. So what we feel and what we believe in talking with our clients and our prospects is that this consolidation, the fact that it's been so unique in each instance, is indicative of an industry that is continuously seeking out the right solutions to serve the needs of the way the marketplace is consuming these services. So it actually seems to us to underscore the opportunity for growth for RPO companies like ourselves, but more importantly, for those that consume these services, it puts them in a much stronger buying position as far as evaluating and being very specific with what their immediate demands are. And we're going to talk about that a little bit around the service segmentation, because this fact that consolidation has been so nondescript and the reality of service segmentation seem to go hand in hand. So keep that in mind when we get to that part. Well, we're going to do it right now. Let's talk about service segmentation right now, in fact. So listen, the RPO service offerings are being segmented even further today, and it's in response to the nature of the market demand. In other words, the way that organizations are seeking to rebuild the recruiting infrastructures after the Great Recession, the way they're seeking to be more cost efficient, the way they're looking to inject a greater cost of value, and the way they source and bring talent into their organization for the long term is much more well-defined today than ever before, and this is driving demand for specific types of service offerings. So let's take a look at some of that segmentation. Now, an end-to-end service offering is what you would think. It's a complete outsourcing of the entire process, usually for a very large segment of the workforce, or in some cases the entire workforce. Traditionally, this is what we would think of when we think about recruitment process outsourcing. So that service demand obviously still exists, but we also see, and this is an area that we actually do a lot of work in, is we see an increased demand in the need for project-based recruiting programs. Really, here we're talking about targeted outsource efforts that have a very specific time frame or a specific number of hires, and it's usually in conjunction or aligned to some specific event within an organization. You've seen this traditionally and historically in big pharma when they're looking to increase their sales force. So they'll actually engage firms to hire that sales force quickly. So that methodology isn't necessarily new, but what is new is that firms more so today are planning out their strategic workforce plan, and instead of injecting more heads into their internal infrastructure, they'll actually engage a company like Yoh to handle the project portion or handle that recruitment need in a project fashion. In addition to that, we see an increase in demand of what looks like point of service deliverables. And here it's a procurement of a single element of sourcing. So for instance, the reference checks is always a popular and easy one to get your mind around. A lot of people outsource the reference check component of onboarding or of hiring. But we see point of service really breaking into just about any segment of the hiring process. So for instance, firms are willing to engage an RPO company to actually conduct just sourcing. So just the engagement to just source candidates that are handed maybe into an internal recruiting team and take it from there. We see a lot of demand for social media recruiting services. This is a very significant area of demand that's increasing for that service offering because it's an area that many organizations are kind of unsure of themselves in, and they want the expertise and help to be able to quickly manage and address the way they're using social media platforms to actively recruit, actively increase employment brand, and use those channels to increase the quality and decrease the overall cost of their hiring processes. So point of service is definitely a way that the buyer sophistication has really increased for them to be able to kind of dictate, hey, this is the segment of the service that I need help with, and that's what I want you to price for me, that's what I want you to partner with me on, and that's where I want you to help me to be successful. On-demand is not necessarily altogether different, but what is notable about on-demand is that it's a specified volume of recruiting or services per period of time. So typically you're paying for a volume or number of hours, and the project is, and again, what's unique about this is you could have on-demand services can kind of overlay the previous two there. So you could have a project-related RPO that's structured in an on-demand fashion. So in other words, I'm not going to consume that help from the RPO provider unless and until I need it. So it's really a run rate type of model where as we partner with our clients, we are there on demand when their needs arise. And it's typically a per month type of fee arrangement that helps them to know that they have the coverage, but they're only incurring the expense when they have to run and increase the volume of talent that's running through their organization. And then lastly, and this is the one that we're very interested in just as a provider, is that this notion of white label recruiting is becoming more and more popular. So what is white labeled recruiting? This is what it sounds like, much like you would put your brand name on a labelless shirt, for instance. Same kind of thing here is that instead of completely outsourcing the recruiting process, you're actually insourcing it with embedded recruiters. And what is most unique is that these embedded recruiters, most of the time, probably about 85–90% of the time, are not handling only permanent positions, but they're handling contracted labor, they're handling permanent labor, they're also maintaining the client employment brand, and it's very recruiting-oriented managed services as far as the managed staffing engagements goes. So what ends up happening is you have a team of recruiting talent that is embedded in the organization, that it exists almost as an extension of the recruiting organization within the company, and handles all needs, labor needs, talent needs of a specific level, whether it's contracted, whether it's a overall statement of work, whether it's full-time teams or whatnot. So we're seeing a significant increase in there. And here's where you're seeing a lot of that maturity that I discussed earlier, and why the marketplace isn't necessarily fully maturing to a point where consolidation means that it's collapsing into just a handful of service providers. Rather, what you're seeing is a combination of similar type service offers that are being oriented much more closely to be an extension of the firm itself and not just a pure outsourced play. So again, the great thing for those that are in the market for these services is that all of these have merit. They all have their pros and cons, so the buyer is in a much stronger position to be able to dictate and pick and choose what makes sense for them. All right, let's shift gears here and talk about co-sourcing, because the buying cycles here have also transitioned to where now a lot of clients of Yoh's and other RPO providers are actually requiring multiple providers, and they're preferring multiple providers over a single provider. So what do I mean by that? Well, much like the previous conversation where we talked about service segmentation, here It's having expertise focus on what they do. So, for instance, in the past, a single provider was driven by a traditional and a very standard procurement process. So, in other words, set-in-stone procurement approach of the organization said, go find a provider to handle the outsourced recruiting needs. Well, CoSourcing is actually introducing, and what it's representing is a more sophisticated buying criteria that's driven direct by the consumers within the organization that have evolving demands. So in other words, the corporate enterprise IT group has a completely different set of demands than maybe the business development and the sales group might. So the sophisticated buying approach says that, listen, we need our specific demands met, and I'd much rather have an expert handling each of these, even if it means I have 2 or 3 providers rather than 1. In addition to that, cost efficiency is almost always the driver in a single provider. And why that's always important in a co-sourced engagement, the cost of value is what ends up being a factor or a metric that's evaluated much more closely. In other words, I, as the organization, understand that these certain set of skills will cost me X to hire. Here's what the cost per hire is going to be. Here's what the time to hire. Here's what my expected retention rate is going to be. And that's a value to me. That quality is a value to me. So therefore, what am I willing to pay to gain that value? So we see in a co-source situation where the different providers that have different specialties usually project and report their results based upon an overall cost of value. Single provider engagements usually target roles that require transactional sourcing and recruiting. So in other words, they have to be poised to scale. That's not atypical of large RPO engagements. In a co-sourced environment, however, the diverse targeted roles really require specific sourcing and recruiting. So in other words, there's specialization that I've been speaking of. So what's also unique here is that in a co-sourced RPO engagement, the client or the customer will really make it clear that there's supposed to be a co-opetition, if you will, between the providers. In other words, they have to be helping one another out. They have to be on the same page, reporting similar data, and collaborating to ultimately serve the end client. Broadly distributed offshore sourcing. What we see in single providers is that sourcing is very frequently outsourced, and it makes sense why that would be. If you have a large transaction RPO deal that, let's say it's for a call center, for a multinational call center, well, these skill sets are somewhat finite and easily defined. Not that they're easily found, but the sourcing can be operationalized, if you will. So in other words, that sourcing will be kind of offshored in some cases, and the job of that offshore group is to simply churn through as great a volume as they can to find viable candidates that meet the criteria of the open positions. In a co-sourced opportunity, it's not to say that offshoring is frowned upon. It's certainly not for certain skill sets, but there's a local and geo-targeted sourcing need that usually arises, and it's typically for higher touch skill sets, like engineering, for instance. We do some RPO for some aerospace and aviation companies, and these engineers are few and far between, and even if there's a high volume that needs to be hired, it's a very hands-on approach, if you will, where they really need to intimately understand the capabilities and the experience and the results of the eventual engineer. So an offshore sourcing engagement wouldn't really make sense there. So there's definitely room for both approaches, but in the co-source opportunity, what you're seeing here in the trend is to co-source in a way that allows me to meet the needs of the different internal organizations. In a single provider instance, there's usually business units are buying on individual cases. So there'll be some collaboration and expanded coverage, but that's how the buying is executed. The trend that we're seeing is that the consolidation of buying, in other words, an organization says, listen, it's a similar service, therefore we want to consolidate that buying and make it more of a shared service. Therefore, what that does is it requires the providers, like I said earlier, to work more closely together to serve the ultimate needs of the client. So you can kind of see, again, there's not that single sourcing will ever go away, but the trend here is more co-source, where organizations are insisting that there be a consolidation of providers or RPO partners and that they work closely together. All right, let's take a look at the priority of pipelining as we spoke of it before. Now, the last set of trends here is that the importance of pipelining is really increasing this year. Not that it has never, been a top priority. It actually has been. But the focus specialization of really hard-to-find talent, what that does is it increases the priority of candidate pipelining. Now, again, I think the caveat here is this is our perspective. Again, we focus a lot on professional-level resources, not necessarily a ton of high transaction, high turnover positions. So that could be indicative of why we see this trend a lot. But we do get asked the questions a lot, and we validated with a lot of the analysts that confirm what we're seeing. So let's take a look at this. The drivers in this focus specialization is really as follows. It's typically hard to find talent on the left here. It's usually in a very competitive employment market. The positions are not just critical, but the time to fill has a business impact. The training requirements are very specific, and they're discretely targeted candidate markets. So in other words, you can kind of see and get the sense here that pipelining becomes a higher priority if these 5 criteria on the left exist, or let's say 4 or even 3 of them exist within the organization. The actions that these firms typically take is that, hey, they need and they want better development of talent communities so they can actually connect and engage with that hard-to-find talent way ahead of their demand and way ahead of actually sourcing them. And the reason for this is to augment and pump up the value of their employment brand within that talent community. They also try to be more aggressive with their social media recruiting strategies so they can connect and engage with these individuals. They spend quite a bit of time, and they require their providers to spend quite a bit of time analyzing the talent marketplace itself and doing an analysis on the talent market. The development of the overall employment brand and the narrative of the employment brand. And what I mean by that is, what's the story of working for company ABC? Not just while you're employed there, but before you were employed, while you were interviewing for that company, how you were onboarded, what it was like in your first year, your first 3 years, what it was like for your career there, how they treated you as you were an alumni of the organization. That's something that, again, the trend is that RPO providers are being asked to provide that employment narrative. And indicative of an employment narrative is a targeted content creation plan. In other words, clients say, listen, we want you to not just build our story, we want you to write our story and give us a plan for sharing that information so we can augment the participation in the talent community and position ourselves well for this hard-to-find talent. So let's take a look at the summary here, and you can kind of see what's ebbing and flowing. So there's the 4 trends as we discussed them on the left here. And in 2013, here's what we see happening. We see the consolidation kind of slowing down a little bit. We see little to no consolidation, at least in the first half of the year. Once we're through this first half of 2013, it could be a completely different landscape, so we'll see when we get there. We do see a rapid growth in CoSourcing as I discussed it. And really, this is buying maturity. That's exactly what this is about. And buying maturity doesn't slow down. Once it gets to a certain point, it just begins to exponentially grow. So we'll see more and more of that. Service segmentation, same thing here. We'll see an increasing demand and the change of the very nature of demand to request very specific service offerings. And then moderate growth, although consistent growth, we see as a priority of pipelining. So talent shortfalls are a reality, especially in some skilled areas. There's a fragmented talent supply. There's so many outlets through which to connect with these engaged individuals. So it will continue to moderately grow here, we see, in 2013. So I haven't really looked at the questions yet. I'm sure there are probably a couple. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to shift gears here and talk about just our approach into this marketplace, and then we'll field and answer all these questions towards the end. So let me go ahead and shift gears and just talk about the way that we approach this. Because I think it's important, again, I'm not saying that ours is the best way. There's a lot of great providers out there, but it is important to ask your providers, or if you're even investigating, hey, how should I consider, because it's a piece of internal service that sometimes organizations have never considered to outsource. So, and the fact that these trends are developing the way they are means there's more opportunity to pick and choose smaller pieces to outsource. So let's take a look at the way that we help our clients. And the first thing we do is we try to take a very strategic approach, where the first thing that Yoh attempts is to place the client's business and strategy objectives central, and then how are the performance metrics going to be handled so there's a proper governance around the delivery against those objectives. I mean, that's the very first thing. Does Yoh understand the strategy? Can we have commentary or recommendation on whether that workforce plan is viable or not? Again, we have the good fortune of seeing many more workforce plans than our clients because they only work on their own. So we're able to kind of exist in an advisory capacity there. We take a look at the addressable candidate marketplace, so we can kind of estimate out what the challenges will be in a recruiting and sourcing approach. We look at the labor pressures for key talent segments. In other words, how hard to find are your most important resources, and then work together to put together a complete workforce strategy and then a tactical plan to execute to achieve it. From there, we'll actually sort out technology issues, and again, technology is always a major component of, especially for larger organizations, of how they recruit, how they engage, how they source. So we usually look at, well, first thing we do is we develop a very aggressive digital sourcing strategy. So we have in place a infrastructure that allows you to do a lot of the talent community development, a lot of the employment narrative and employment content that we talked of earlier, and we help integrate that social outreach and monitoring within the organization and social media recruiting. So we bring those two things to the table. More tactical pieces of technology like applicant tracking and reference checking and things like that. We don't actually bring technology to the table, but we usually partner with client-owned or newly introduced automation or technology. So we have plenty of relationships with just about any provider in those areas, so we work closely with you and the technology partner to make sure that it sits on top of the governance to address those business objectives and strategies. And then again, we talked about the performance benchmarks. We'll agree upon, hey, these are the performance metrics that will matter in whatever the service segment that you are looking to round out. This is an example of some of the technology players. Again, this is it really doesn't matter to a company like Yoh. We'll integrate and interact with just about any technology partner that's out there. We have some very good relationships with those that are here. But let's shift gears here and talk about just the complete process coverage. Once all that discovery is in place, we'll then deploy a process that matches the need. And sometimes in that deployment process, even though the buying sophistication has matured, what we find is sometimes in the discovery process, while maybe an entire RPO outsourcing was being considered, we might find that the sourcing and the recruiting are the biggest needs. So maybe onboarding process is covered. So we'll be able to tell which processes match the need. We'll evaluate those current processes for improvement. So in other words, is your sourcing process in place something that is viable, or can it be improved upon? So we'll do that. We then begin to identify some of the key talent bottlenecks that are holding up quality or increasing your cost of quality. And we'll improve the overall cost to hire and increase internal customer satisfaction. I mean, ultimately, any RPO should be able to, claim those two things, and we certainly focus on both in whatever capacity, whether it's project, whether it's on demand, whether it's just providing a white label recruiting where we're handling contracted labor and permanent labor. That's what we'll do to come in and kind of evaluate. I do want to touch on one more thing here, and this is the focus on strategic sourcing and recruiting. If you'll notice that a lot of the nuance between the trends here has a lot to do with how engaged I am with the talent community, how I'm able to segment out my service providers so they could focus very specifically on hard-to-find talent. And what we try to do and what we like to recommend, whether you are partnering with Yoh or not, is that you focus very specifically on strategic sourcing and recruiting. So let's take a quick look at that. And again, as I mentioned earlier, each of these trends, except for maybe the consolidation, has an element to it that is driven by the need to improve the strategic sourcing and the way that the talent community is being engaged and the overall recruiting process. So as far as focused talent acquisition, what we try to do is we take a look at the community on the whole, and we evaluate based upon the demands of our client, what their needs are, what they're trying to accomplish for the year, what the high priority skill sets are, what the operational skill sets needed to really drive success and to operationally execute, and even even in the administrative level to just make sure that the lights are kept on and things like that. We take a look at all these things and try to identify, okay, here's the set of skills, the common skills, the hard to find skills, the skills that happen on demand that make up that workforce plan. We take a look at the relevant experience of not just the resume experience, but the applicable project experience, the like work experience, the tenure that individuals have within these organizations or what their success level has been, And then we also look at the career aspirations of the individuals. A lot of time, especially when we're talking about retention, the career aspirations must match the employment brand and culture of the organization. That's a natural and good fit. So things like career goals, what's the average and typical career goal for an individual that meets this talent profile? What's their career path been and where are they headed? And what kind of guidance have they received? And what are the companies that they would target as the perfect employer? So we take all these and then we really say, look, those that are in the intersection of the three as we define them, that's the perfect talent. That's the perfect person in the talent community that we need to engage and target. And then from here, and this is just Yoh's approach, but I'm sure a lot of the other providers take a similar approach here, is that we structure everything around that paradigm. So we have something called talent reach, which is the way that we reach out locally, but also are able to recruit nationally against this paradigm. So what it allows us to do is increase our reach, increase our clients' reach, and offer scalability that's easily ramped up or down on demand. This is, again, comes a lot from our on-demand experience because that's how our customers like to interact. In addition to that, we focus on targeted sourcing, which is really a lot to do with how the talent community is engaged, what the direct to candidate experience looks like, make sure that access is assured. So, and again, trying to source ahead of that demand. That's really what this is about. So using and leveraging a lot of these digital social platforms, whether it's recruiting platforms, job boards, whatever it might be, community boards or whatnot, to take an amalgamation of all of these things to ensure that hiring managers have access to the talent that they need way ahead of their demand. That's the job of an RPO, and that's certainly what Yoh tries to do. We also want to increase and improve the responsiveness to talent depth. So in other words, create a virtual bench if it's possible in certain areas. And again, this is especially on the high-touch, hard-to-find, very skilled professionals. You want to operate in a way that they're virtually ready when the demand rises. And then lastly, a reference point sort of quality process that is what it sounds like, is making sure that the onboarding process ensures consistency and that quality is also assured. So what's unique about this is the trends we discussed and the way that an RPO provider approaches these trends ultimately, especially the 3 of the 4 trends we went over, ultimately are driven by a focused talent acquisition process and sourcing process. So look, that's about it. That's all I had for today. I hope you learned a thing or two here. Again, this is our perspective. This is what we see in talking with a lot of the analysts that cover the space, in talking with a lot of our clients and what their needs are. We'd love to hear some alternative opinions, though. So by all means, either certainly feel free to add something in the question if you have 1 or 2 questions, or by all means, there's my email there below or my Twitter handle. You could send me something after the fact. In the meantime, let's take a look at the question box here. And by the way, if you're not familiar with webinar, go to webinar. There's a little control panel. You can type your questions in. The ever popular, will the slides be available? Yes, we'll send a follow-up email to those that attended. You'll receive a PDF version of the slides for you to look at. You will also get a link to we usually post these things on our YouTube channel, so if you want to share it, we encourage you to do so. I have a question here about service segmentation, and the question says, you discussed the increase in demand of social media recruiting. How is that outsourced, and how can Yoh help? Well, it's a good question. I think, listen, here's why. This is why it's a increasing question around, can this function or can this segment of recruiting be outsourced? Mostly because it's a time-intensive task. To properly affect social media recruiting, it's more of a cultural shift for an organization than it is a tactical kind of how I do my job shift. And what I mean by that is that it works best if I'm continuously sharing information, if their personality is and the brand of how we employ and how we work with people is continuously broadcast out. That takes content, it takes consistency, it takes frequency. And, oh, by the way, to actually mine and source candidates over social media recruiting, the upside is the candidates are usually much more viable. They are much more well aligned with the needs of the company because we've had that opportunity to engage them. The hiring process is usually a lot more quick because, again, you've been discussing and engaging them. That's the upside. The challenge is that it's a time-consuming task. So to be disciplined enough to develop and define your employment narrative, to actually write it out, to structure content against that employment narrative, and then execute a content development and sharing program across multiple social channels, that's a lot of work. And oh, by the way, do all that in a way where you're actually sourcing candidates, that's even more work. So that's a big reason why Yoh is able to help clients. That's a big reason why we see an increase in this trend, because everyone wants to use the tools, but sometimes they want help in making the use of that tool happen. Okay, I think that's about the last question. So listen, I want to thank you very much for your time. We're excited about 2013. We think that it's going to be a very productive year for RPO. And if you do have any other questions, by all means, please feel free to drop me a line or just send me a note on Twitter or however you'd like. Thanks so much for your time, and please look forward to joining us again in the future. Take care.